Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Stuart Buck. Stuart is the executive director of the Good Science Project, a kind of think tank devoted to better understanding how science is done and funded. Stuart was previously a vice president at Arnold Ventures, focusing on, among other things, scientific practice and reproducibility, and has a PhD in education policy and a JD. Stuart wrote a fascinating essay last year for Palladium Magazine entitled The Case for Crazy Philanthropy, and I wanted to speak with him about this idea. We had a chance to discuss the nature and history of this kind of crazy philanthropy, while we don't see as much as we could, and how to incentivize everything from risk-taking to new and weird types of research institutions. This was recorded back in September 2025, so some of our discussion might be a bit dated. This conversation was fascinating, and I had a great time speaking with Stuart. Let's begin. Stuart, so good to be talking with you, and welcome to the Orthogonal Bet.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is exciting. I guess there's a lot of topics we can go down. I wanted to first start with this awesome essay you had in Palladium Magazine called The Case for Crazy Philanthropy. Maybe you can talk about what like the main thrust of the idea is, as well as kind of what spurred you to write this almost like manifesto.
Right. I mean, what spurred me to write it, I'll be perfectly candid, was a conversation I had a couple of years ago at a conference with Samo Burya, who helps run Palladium and Bismarck, has his fingers in lots of pies. And he, in this course of this conversation, he said that we should try to get billionaires to invest in more outside the box ideas in science. And that was kind of the thrust of the conversation. No real specifics, but just that general framework. And so over the next year or so, I just kind of had that idea circulating in the back of my mind. I was trying to, it's kind of hard to think of specific examples off the top of your head, but I kept my eye out for them whenever I would, come across a book or an article. And so over the next year, I happened to read a great book called The Woman Who Smashed Codes. In fact, I've got it sitting right here. And it's a biography of a woman named Elizabeth Friedman and her husband, William Friedman. Originally were working for this really wealthy Chicago philanthropist named Fabian. He had this estate called Riverbank that was like 350 to 500 acres. Different sources say different things. So this kind of magnificent estate where he hired a lot of scientists to come work there. And also he had this project that was a little bit crackpotish in trying to prove that someone other than Shakespeare is actually the author and that there were hidden codes within the works of Shakespeare. And in fact, he already had a woman on staff whose last name was Gallup, like the Pole, who had written a book purporting to prove that Francis Bacon had hidden codes within Shakespeare. But Fabian, to his credit, wanted other people to double check this work. And unsurprisingly, there's lots of opportunities for overfitting. When you search something as massive as the works of Shakespeare in order to ascertain whether any imaginable pattern you can come up with can be matched to the words in some fashion. So long story short, the Friedmans ended up working on this kind of crackpot project to discover codes, but they also ended up kind of helping develop modern cryptology. And so when the United States got involved in World War I, there were no code breaking units in the United States government. And so they ended up hiring Riverbank Laboratories and the Friedmans to help try to decode messages throughout the war. And anyway, long story short, the Friedmans ended up moving to DC, and they both had kind of separate paths. They worked for like Coast Guard, Treasury, Army, a bunch of different agencies. And their work ended up leading to the founding of the National Security Agency in part. 1952, and the National Security Agency to this day has a kind of headquarters type building named after the Friedmans. So that was just one example that I just stumbled across in that year. But the kind of crazy outside the box philanthropy that inadvertently led to something completely different, namely modern cryptology. So anyway, I just started looking for more and more examples over the next year, and then finally kind of just was able to put together a piece that had enough kind of credible examples. And so, kind of the motivation is that, there's a lot of philanthropy that kind of looks mimetically identical to each other, or it's just, there are various shades that, try to add a little more money to the scientists, a little more freedom, a little more flexibility, but it still occurs within the framework of the existing scientific academic ecosystem. And so the thrust of the piece is just that philanthropists, unlike government, you don't have to answer to voters and you don't have to do something that's, democratically justifiable, to the taxpayer. You can explore interesting, weird, crazy ideas. And through that sort of like high variance philanthropy, I just argue there's a place for that. So philanthropists should do more than just say, here's a bunch of money for Stanford, or here's a bunch of money for Chicago or Harvard, or kind of the traditional institutions. That's all great as well. But there should be a scope within philanthropy, or a greater scope for high net worth individuals, and even foundations, I would argue, should occasionally fund some outside the box ideas. And a lot of them will fail, and that's great. It's kind of like a more of a venture capital approach, like fund stuff where some of it's going to fail, but some of it through this kind of high variance approach might lead to completely unexpected discoveries and new places that you didn't anticipate.
I love this idea. And it's interesting you mentioned with venture capital, because I feel like a lot of the people who are wealthy, like high net worth individuals, they often made their money by taking a lot of risk. But
Mhm.
then when it comes to giving it away, like with philanthropy, suddenly they become a lot more risk averse. And like, could you have a sense of like why that is? Like where they kind of just go down the very well-trod paths of you give your money to the following X institutions or whatever it is, as opposed to saying, no, I tried a lot of weird things. I disrupted stuff to make my
Mhm.
money. I want to do the same kind of thing for philanthropy.
Right. I do kind of have a kind of amateurish psychology type theory as to why that might be the case. Because in investing, if you invest in 10 startup companies and 9 of them fail, but then the 10th one is, Google in the year 2000, that literally pays off for your other investments, right? So if you make 100x on one investment, that pays for the other investments. So you're like literally trading off a financial loss in one place, but a much greater financial gain somewhere else. But in philanthropy, at least traditional philanthropy, you're not really getting a financial return. You're not getting dollars back. Instead, a lot of times the motivation for philanthropy can be kind of reputation and seeking the approval of others, feeling like you've done something good in the world, those sorts of motivations. And in that case, I'm not sure that the psychological trade-off is quite as easy and direct as it is when it comes to finances. If I say I want to do good in the world and I invest or I give to 9 different charities and they all collapse, and then I give money to a 10th charity and it turns out to be pretty okay and it does kind of well, I'm not sure the psychology. I might still feel like I wasted a lot of money on those 90% 9 charities that failed, and it's not like the 10th one provides 100 times more psychological like rewards or reputational rewards to me. So instead, in the philanthropic world, if most of what you do fails, then maybe your peers and your colleagues look at you and say you're kind of failing a lot in philanthropy. What are you doing? So I don't know. I just wonder if that's kind of the psychology of it in some way.
Do you think there's a way of changing how we think about reputation and credit for these? And because I wonder, maybe that's the way to do this kind of thing, or just find more people who don't actually care what their peers think of, like, oh yeah, like I tried 10 things, 9 of them flopped, but one of them, I don't know, led to like the Green Revolution or whatever it is. I mean, like,
Yeah. Well, that would be absolutely worth it.
exactly. It's like you'd be like, oh yeah, it's like, so it doesn't matter. Like that's the point. I'm taking big swings. Do you have any ideas of how to actually affect that sort of cultural shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just a broader awareness within both the philanthropic community and people who are adjacent to it, that we should be willing to celebrate successes and not always point the fingers like, why did, Mark Zuckerberg, why did you donate so much money to New Jersey schools? This is, probably a decade ago. Why did you waste, however many millions of dollars on this, you know, philanthropic experiment with schools that didn't work? Well, instead of pointing the finger, let's celebrate the successes where they are, instead of like the constant kind of critiques of like philanthropy that somehow failed in some fashion. And maybe just like kind of literally applying more of a portfolio mindset, that if you do indeed come up with some great philanthropic way of helping the world, then maybe we should be willing to tolerate and say that makes up for other philanthropic experiments that may have flopped or failed in some fashion.
Within philanthropy, you see a certain amount of concern around metrics and efficiency, which I think in some ways is actually very good. But like, do you think that that kind of obsession with efficiency and like bang for your buck kind of thing makes philanthropists and organizations who are engaging in philanthropy more incremental and like risk averse, and like there should just be a little bit more willingness to try like kind of weird things?
Yeah, I mean that. I think you're maybe kind of alluding to ideas in philanthropy like the effective altruism movement, or kind of actually similar ideas within kind of international economic development that have, and education. I mean, multiple fields that have focused on like where can we do a randomized trial and figure out how to make the best improvement in an education system or in an economic system or malaria prevention or what have you. I don't object to doing randomized trials at all. I think we should do more randomized trials in public policy and in philanthropy and dedicate more dollars to things that work as opposed to things that don't work. But I would also say that things that you can test via randomized trials in the world of public policy and philanthropy often do tend to be kind of incremental in nature. They tend to be something that can be delivered at scale to thousands or millions of people, and that where there's some like legible bureaucratic reason for like testing, doing A/B testing in the field of some intervention or program. And it's less likely, you're not doing a randomized trial. The example I gave with Fabian and Riverbank and early cryptology, like that's, you can do a randomized trial on what are there codes in Shakespeare? Like, I don't right. Or other examples that I give in the piece, like Nat Friedman and the Scroll Prize. Like, again, that's not something that just the idea of a randomized trial doesn't seem to fit. This is not an intervention. This is not a program. I mean, it's yeah. So yeah, I think trying to look for legible markers of success, I do think that's an improvement over the kind of feel-good philanthropy that says, well, let's just give money to people that put our names on a building, or interventions that sound good but don't work. At the same time, we need more of that space for outside-the-box ideas that are not fully legible and testable right in the moment.
And you mentioned this a little bit before. I want to discuss more about like institutions. Oftentimes, even if you're not giving money to existing institutions and you're starting new institutions, oftentimes those institutions, let's say like academic institutions or kind of scientific research organizations, they often look very similar to kind of traditional ones, just with kind of like maybe a few tweaks or a little bit of a twist. And of course, I'm not trying not to change everything can be good to kind of make sure you're not necessarily like throwing like the baby out with the bathwater. But at the same time, though, when things look so similar, it often means you're going to get kind of similar kinds of results. Like there's not actually that much risk taking involved. How do you think about like institutional innovation and like true innovation in terms of like really trying new kinds of institutions? And as you know, like I'm very interested in kind of like new types of research organizations. I think a lot about this, but many of them, right, they often don't feel nearly as novel as they could. Yeah. So how do you think about I guess two things. One is how to incentivize truly novel institutional creation. But then also, like, yeah, what is the white space in this high dimensional space of institutional forms that like really should be tried or experimented?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's super interesting. So I give one example in the piece of, actually, I could have given more examples, but like there was this like burst of establishing new universities in the late 19th century. So Leland Stanford, of course, established Leland Stanford Junior University, named after his son. Amos Troop established Troop University, which is now known as Caltech. Then we have like Vanderbilt, Rice, Duke, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, Carnegie Mellon. I mean, it's probably more that I can't even think of, but a lot of top universities now that are named after or receive significant donations from late 19th century philanthropists. So you see all this flurry of innovation, but as of today, all those universities look really similar. Right. And I outline the piece, they have the same kind of 4-year degree program, the same like set of PhDs and postdocs, the same set of academic fields, the same governance structure, the same hierarchy of tenure professors versus early. So, and why is that? Why would they all look the same? And there's some sociological ideas about, this kind of institutional isomorphism and the pressure from both from law and from kind of imitative practices and professional norms to create institutions that all look kind of alike, at least on paper. There has been some institutional innovation more recently. So focused research organizations are a way of doing science, for example, that tend to be time bound. So setting a time frame of 5 years or maybe longer in some cases, and organized around some specific legible scientific goal. So that's interesting. So there they tinkered with like I guess two of the kind of institutional characteristics that one could tinker with. How much are you focused on one goal in one field, and how long do you exist? But you're right. I mean, I've kind of toyed with the idea of, and haven't been able to articulate it fully, but of writing a piece on all the different kind of institutional characteristics that one might also vary. So you might have, what kind of team size is the organization built around? Again, time frame, that also matters. Degree of focus, like the focus research organizations are literally focused on one thing. What if it was more interdisciplinary in nature? Maybe there are lots of other like institutional characteristics that one can think about, deliberately varying and playing with, so that new institutions. And I could name names, like maybe Chan Zuckerberg's BioHub or the Arc Institute. Those are all doing great things. Like I love what they're doing. But it's like they're taking existing university researchers and varying one thing, like how much money they get or how much freedom do they have to explore without articulating all their goals in advance. But yeah, again, I would love to see like more of a kind of mapping out of this, as you say, high-dimensional space. And maybe there's some combinations of factors that would make absolutely no sense in a new organization, but maybe there are some that are fruitful possibilities, and that we just haven't like hit that point in the space yet, or thought of a way to describe it. I mean, that's kind of the genius behind FROs and focused research organizations, is they have a name. Once you have a name and a concept, then people can talk about it, right? They can say what they like or don't like, or they can raise money for it and so forth. So maybe we just need to map out different possibilities and name some of them, and then see who wants to try it.
No, I love this. Yeah. And parallels a lot of my own thinking. And I've talked to other people, but yeah, about like creating almost this, like a set of like what is the genome of institutional forms, and like, yeah, mutating those different things. Like, here's the features of like for-profit versus nonprofit, funding people versus projects, and like changing that, or the time frame, or yeah, the team size, or relative degree of interdisciplinary, right? There's a lot of things. And I also, yeah, I'm fairly agnostic as to like what is the right like forms that we should be trying, but I just want more people to be trying these different kinds of things, because we clearly have not actually navigated that entire space and found like, yeah, like, because it shouldn't just be, oh yeah, like we're doing everything in the like traditional universities or even corporate industry labs or startups. Like, those are just a few points in some weird high dimensional space. We got to actually explore that space. Related to that, and you were talking also about like the time frame. One of the things I think a lot about, though, is, I mean, maybe eventually, far from the future, there'll be an entire parallel ecosystem of lots of new types of weird research organizations, and people can kind of move around from one to another. But right now, we certainly don't have that. There's kind of like sort of like the norm, and then you have a few things kind of around the edges. And one of my concerns is that oftentimes organizations that even start out a little weird, they kind of end up like reverting, not quite to the mean, but like to looking like academic kind of things. And there's a number of different reasons. And potentially one of them, though, is that the people who join, they're thinking, oh, maybe this is not necessarily a fit for me, or I might, or the thing will fall apart. And so I have to kind of like always think about maybe going back into academia. And so oftentimes they kind of just make themselves look understandable and like good fits to traditional academia. And so I guess related to this, though, is like, one, is it because as organizations last longer, that they kind of converge on these kinds of things, and you might have to like actively kind of force that. And so maybe having a limited time frame actually can help protect against that kind of thing. But also, how do you think about attracting people to these things, but making sure that they kind of do what the organization actually wants to do, as opposed to kind of still making themselves academic kind of things?
Mm. Yeah. No, I think you've hit on something important there, which is, you're exactly right, that if scientists feel correctly that there are many tens of billions of dollars spent by the federal government every year on the traditional university system through NIH, NSF, NASA, Department of Defense, a lot of their research, et cetera, then they kind of feel like that's the norm. And if I go do something that's too different, maybe I'm now locked out of the norm for the future. And that seems high risk. Now, in some other areas of life, like with startups, we kind of counterbalance that high risk by saying, maybe if you're lucky, you'll join a unicorn as it's starting up, and it will pay you handsomely. We don't offer that deal quite as much to professors and scientists, except if they have come up with a startup themselves, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
we
They commercialize something. Yeah.
we don't offer them that upside, and then kind of normal practice of things. So they probably rightfully should be a little more risk averse. But I do wonder, like, there's this area of policy schools, so like the Harvard Kennedy School, that will regularly bring on faculty members or professional fellows who do not look like traditional academics, who maybe have spent a lot of their career in the federal government, right? To kind of being a practitioner, so to speak, of public policy, as opposed to a scholar per se. Someone who has a PhD and writes a bunch of academic papers. And I wonder if we just need more kind of alternate career tracks for scientists, like at universities. Like, if you're a scientist and you spent all of your time working at, I don't know, Corning's material science lab, just being a practitioner, or you spent 20 years working in R&D at Pfizer. And maybe we need many more opportunities within academia for folks like that to join, even if they don't have any publications at all, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I love this idea. Right. You're right. Maybe eventually there'll be this like parallel ecosystem of lots of different things, but we also need, right, academia to kind of create pockets within itself that offer more opportunities for people who, right, don't necessarily fit that exact like very like simple kind of
Right.
profile. Like there should be lots of different kinds of profiles of people that could be able to fit into academia. Yeah, I mean, like, and again, it could be like people who like were in the startup world for a little while. And you mentioned like the Kennedy School is kind of an example that does this more regularly. I feel like on a one-off basis, you can probably also like find examples of
Hmm.
like places or people that are kind of willing to take chances on people, interesting scientists who have done very non-traditional kinds of things. Can you think of examples of universities that are more willing to either like hire non-traditional scientists or pockets within various universities that kind of that create like a center or something like that for that kind of thing? Or is this really like you are like this is a charge and a call? You're like saying like we need to do more of this because I can't think of any examples.
I mean, with the caveat that I don't know every, center at every
Of
university,
course.
right?
Yeah.
So I mean, they're not. Yeah, no great examples come to mind. I could easily be missing something, but I guess maybe that's kind of the point. That like it's well known that the Harvard Kennedy School and places like that are a place where you can go if you've been a city mayor or
Right.
a congressman or whatever. Like it's not the traditional academic. So it seems to me there should be like a bunch of obvious places that come to mind where like if you've been a practicing scientist, you don't feel like you're an outcast. I mean, a lot of early stage scientists, will say that they feel like there's kind of a binary choice. If you want to go into academia, okay, you got to stick around and do postdocs, and you have to, find a junior professor position, and it's, publish, 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 until you get tenure. I mean, it's one track, right? Whereas if you go and join industry, you're almost seen as a traitor to academia, and now you've knocked yourself off of that track of the postdoc to junior professor, et cetera. And I think academia just needs to be less binary in that sense, more open to taking on practitioners or people who have worked for different organizations, people who've worked for FROs. I'll be interested in a few years to see if people who jumped off and worked at an FRO for 5 years, what do they do next?
Or it could be the kind of thing where it's people who the people who are more likely to join an FRO or any sort of non-traditional sort of thing are the people who they already knew that academia was not going to be a fit for them. And so they kind
Right.
of knew they would always have to chart their own
There's a,
path.
there's a huge selection effect right now.
I'd love to kind of also just hear a little bit of like your own path. Because you also started, I guess, in kind of more in that realm of academia. Like, how did you kind of decide to chart the path that you ended up doing?
Right. Well, it's very serendipitous in a way. In 2012, I had a good friend, who went to go join what was then known as the Lauren John Arnold Foundation. So Lauren John Arnold, at the time, were 38 years old. John Arnold made several $billion running a hedge fund, and was a great natural gas trader. He had reportedly 100% returns on average for 10 years in a row. So he did fabulously well. Retired at 38 and decided to put their money into a foundation to give away to public policy issues. And so my friend went to join, and then he said, "Oh, this is great new foundation. Like no one even knows about it yet, but you should come. We have a director of research position." Anyway, so I ended up joining, and so I guess I'd been planning on going to academia, but then this opportunity arose at the key decision time, and that's the way that I went. And so probably no more academia for me, I guess, at this point.
And is this one of these things where you seem very happy with your choice, but like, do we just need more stories like that of people kind of charting that path to kind of let people know in academia, like, oh yeah, there is this whole world outside of kind of even outside traditional academia or even traditional industry. Like
Mhm.
there is a huge suite of possibilities.
Yeah, I went to like someone who joined Arnold after I left, but who was a friend of mine. Her name's Jennifer Doliak. She was an economics professor at a couple of major universities, and left a tenured position to go lead their criminal justice work at Arnold a couple years ago. And she's been promoting that message on social media regularly. That like, hey, folks who are unhappy in academia, unhappy with the bureaucracy, unhappy with even if you get a grant, sometimes your university takes 9 months to let you have the money. I mean, she has a whole host of problems that she had in academia. And she says, look, there's life outside of academia. You can be happy. You can accomplish things in the world. Yeah. So anyway, that's when I joined in 2012. So back to working on kind of metascience or problems within science. Right in that summer was when there were some news stories about replicability in psychology. And so both John Arnold and I noticed those independently and started talking about them. And he asked me to look into the issue more broadly. Yeah, long story short, I ended up seeing that, okay, there are people in multiple fields, from medicine to cancer biology to social science, who are pointing to problems with publication bias, what's known as p-hacking, trying to hack your way to the lowest p-value possible, kind of cherry picking your data. I mean, lots and lots of issues, sometimes outright fraud. And that kind of creates a problem. So the Arnolds wanted to focus on evidence-based policy across a number of areas, including, as I've mentioned, criminal justice, but also education and health. And if there are all these problems with the published literature, and you're not sure what you can trust, or what's been, what null results haven't been published, then it becomes harder to do what the Arnolds have said they originally thought they would do, which is like kind of review the academic literature, find like what are the top 3 education interventions, and where the evidence is overwhelming, and then just give money to those. I mean, they learned it's not as simple as that. And then you add in replication and publication bias and all those issues, then you're like, wow, I'm not sure what to do. How do I promote evidence-based policy if I don't know what the evidence is? So that's why I ended up leading a grant-making initiative at Arnold for several years that handed out around $60 million to try to improve research, open science, replication, all those kinds of issues.
Related to the current science funding landscape, I mean, things have sort of changed quite a bit in terms of the United States. Yeah, what is your take on those changes, right? Like both like a sense on like near term effects, longer term, and if you have any predictions, how would you kind of think about some of these kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of wow. Where to start? So
It's a very large question. I
yeah,
apologize.
so like to pick off certain aspects in different pieces. So like there has been an effort on the part of the administration to cancel a bunch of grants that are already in progress at places like NIH and NSF. Cancel them because they're too focused on diversity or gender related issues, or some cases climate issues. A number of subjects that the administration politically disagrees with. And so I think there's been a lot of controversy around that. My hot take would be that like the long-term impact is probably less. I mean, because what we're talking about there is like with regards to NIH and NSF, the last time I looked, it was something like maybe 2 to 3% of their overall grants. So the other 98% of their grants are still, in progress. Ultimately, like while each grant cancellation is of course very disruptive, can be disruptive to a field or disruptive to the professors in the labs involved in particular. But still in the grand scheme of things, like there can be 2 to 3%, kind of fluctuations in funding that, aren't the end of the world. I think would have bigger impact over the long run is like the administration has tried to propose cutting budgets across science agencies, 40% at NIH, more like 50% at NSF, and I think 80% when it comes to like NSF's math funding. They propose cutting NASA's space science. I mean, just kind of across the board cuts everywhere. And even if Congress pushes back, the White House also has a theory that the president can just refuse to spend money that's been allocated, and that's essentially unchallengeable. And so that's setting up what potentially just a much more dramatic like constitutional crisis over like, can the president unilaterally just not spend half of science funding? I mean, that to me, like, so anyway, I'm saying that is a much bigger and more like dramatic issue than
Certainly.
the 2 to 3% grants that got cut, even though, as unfortunate as that might have been for those people. The bigger picture issue is what I would be more worried about, just because of the scope of what it would mean if you actually pulled the plug on 40% of science funding, even if Congress tried to keep it.
Yeah, that is.
That's very worrisome.
Yeah, no, that is extremely worrisome. And you've also written a little bit about, and I guess this is probably more in that 2 to 3%, the projects that were devoted to like measuring like education and like certain kinds of, and like that will also potentially have some like really detrimental longer term effects, because we won't even have data anymore to do certain kinds of things.
Another problem with is just a lack of overall transparency. I mean, but yeah, early on with Doge, there were some, the Department of Government Efficiency, there were some dramatic cuts that they made to the Department of Education that, when you dug into it, they were bragging about canceling contracts that were intended, for example, to measure the United States science and math performance as compared to other developed countries. So anytime you've seen charts, that say here's American science and here's versus European countries, or spread out by country, those types of tests. I mean, that takes a lot of money and effort to develop the random sampling, to develop the tests themselves, and to administer that, and do it in a way that is actually comparable across countries. And it looked to me like Doge was just canceling that just to be able to say, look, we canceled a $20 million contract. And I'm like, wow, that's very damaging. Like
Yeah.
we're trying to save relative pennies compared to the federal budget, and then the risk is that we no longer know how American kids are doing in school. So I think that's
It's very
not good.
extremely short sighted, like almost
Right,
like zero sighted.
right. And some of them might get restored, but it's like it's very hard to find out the actual status of it because again, like a lot of the departments like have been so focused on firing a lot of people, laying off people, putting people on leave, and then the people who are left are often afraid to say much publicly, and so it's hard to wrap your head around at this point.
Related to science funding potentially being cut by half, when you wrote this article about the case for crazy philanthropy, was the subtext a little bit that like private philanthropy needs to step in? Because and my sense is probably not, because oftentimes a lot of philanthropy is kind of at the margin. Like there's a lot of science, like federal science funding is very important, but it's often not for really, really crazy kinds of things. It's like, here's like the bulk of stuff that we need to do. And then maybe at the margin, private philanthropy can do certain things. And sometimes the government can also fund kind of crazier things like with DARPA and stuff like that.
Right.
If federal funding drops by half, like how do you think about science in the United States going forward? Like, is there a potential for like science philanthropy to kind of step in? How do we kind of figure out the balance between kind of the, like just the sort of workaday kind of stuff versus the crazier kind of things? Is the effect going to simply be most scientists will actually just move abroad because it's not like they can even move into kind of non-traditional institutions? There's just not going to be an infrastructure for that. Like how do you think about the relationship between like, these changes, philanthropy, where scientists are going to go, how they kind of think about the work that they do?
I mean, I kind of fear that like the potential changes at the federal level make it less likely that the kind of crazy philanthropy I'm talking about would actually happen because, and we've already seen this, there are a lot of philanthropies that have seen what's happening at the federal level, and their immediate impulse is to say, hey, we'll offer some grants to like help support a lab whose grant got canceled, or to fund the same things the federal government was already funding, but now is trying to cut. And so if science philanthropy, which in a good year is nowhere near even like half of what the federal government puts out, as far as I can tell, if they become even more concerned about just like filling in the gaps that the federal government has left, then there's probably even less room for this kind of bold experimentation that I'm hoping to see. So, yeah.
I'm right, because my sense is right. The bold experimentation, it has to be in balance with the kind of more traditional sort of research, and you can't. And right, if they're just trying to fill the gaps and make sure that things continue to operate, then there's less of a space for that. Yeah. So do you have any predictions here in terms of what's going to happen in the United States going forward in terms of like science and funding and philanthropy?
Well, as Yogi Berra said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future.
Maybe you can just elucidate like a certain number, like a few scenarios of like potentially way things can go forward.
Right. Again, with the caveat that like a year ago, I would not have predicted Doge. And then when Doge was announced, I wouldn't have predicted how it would go and so forth. Right.
Yeah.
Or the cuts it would try to make to science. Yeah. I can see a future in which Congress pushes back, as they already have begun to do with regard to NIH funding in particular, and adopting budgets that, or at least stopgap kind of budgets that do not, in fact, make 40% cuts. So don't make any cuts. In fact, make a little bit of an increase. And I can imagine a future in which, the few, as far as I can tell, one or two folks at the White House who are eager to cut science funding and to kind of set up a clash with universities and have the president unilaterally impound federal money, in which they kind of lose that political battle, and other folks see that the public relations catastrophe that is going to arise when when they cancel children's brain cancer clinical trials and things like that. It's one thing to cancel the more politically controversial studies, but you start the 2 to 3%. But if you start cutting 40%, like you're going to be cutting things like cancer clinical trials and things that will result in like congressional investigations and incredibly sympathetic, people with cancer appearing and saying, look, you cut off my chance to live when you cut off my trial, like that. Nobody wants that. So that's what I imagine might be a likely future at this point, that like maybe, and hopefully the kind of constitutional crisis of White House saying, we're not even going to do it, and Congress saying, spend the money, and then the Supreme Court has to step in. Maybe that doesn't even happen. Maybe if folks kind of back down when they see like what's actually at stake when you canceled that much money, much of which is spent in places like Alabama and Oklahoma and Texas and, states that have Republican senators and congressmen. So that's kind of one feature that I imagine. But there may be still some other dramatic changes that happen under the surface. I've heard rumors that folks or somebody somewhere is thinking about, can we kind of redesign the National Science Foundation, NSF? What would that look like? I don't know. There have been folks that have talked about like more fundamental reorganization of NIH, which is probably a conversation worth having. Right now, Congress has pushed back, but I can imagine other kind of more dramatic changes happening that where maybe the funding is similar, so that Congress is happy, but it gets rearranged, and maybe there's some potential to do some innovation in funding if that kind of thing occurs. Those are a couple of, I guess, possibilities.
Okay. No, thank you. And then related to, yeah, like different like experiments with funding, and you've also written about like ways of funding neglected research, which is a little bit different than kind of like the crazy philanthropy idea. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what need you see there.
There are many anecdotes where like people, even Nobel Prize winners, Lasker Prize winners, et cetera, will say that like they had trouble getting funding in their early days, or that they're lucky they did their prize winning work in the 70s or 80s rather than proposing it today. And that all, of course, is anecdotal, but I do think that like when a lot of like top scientists have a similar anecdote, that kind of means something, right? Kind of means that maybe we're
Right,
missing.
so maybe there's like some direction you should pursue.
Right. And then of course there are anecdotes like Katalin Kariko, whose mRNA research famously went unfunded for a long time, and she did not drop out of academia. She found kind of a junior position in someone else's lab, stuck around just despite the discouragement that her university at NIH, were providing. But yeah, it makes me wonder, like, what if there are other people that also had potentially Nobel Prize winning ideas, but who left academia after 3 or 4 years when they couldn't get funding, and it looked like they weren't going to get tenure and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I do think, and this would be politically difficult, but I wish we could have like a national institute for like orphan ideas, a national institute for neglected research, something like that, where the whole point would be to fund stuff that would end up being more high variance than normal. It's not the crazy stuff. It's not funding looking for codes in Shakespeare or deciphering ancient scrolls or that kind of thing. It's still funding traditional science, but it's just funding ideas that perhaps are not as mainstream or that are more contrarian. Again, a lot of great ideas in science were contrarian at the time, whether it's the germ theory of disease or continental drift, or the idea that bacteria could cause ulcers. Whether it's politically viable is a different question, because again, politicians don't like stuff that fails. But maybe with a more of a DARPA type mindset, you could sell as more of a DARPA type mindset that we're funding a lot of ideas that some of them might fail, some of them might turn out to be the next germ theory or the next CRISPR or the next mRNA.
Yeah, and do you think there's a space for, and if it's hard to actually get that through politically, like would there be a space for actually doing that with private philanthropy, of like creating that some sort like that kind of like funding mechanism for those kinds of
Yeah.
ideas?
I mean, yeah, it's private philanthropy. I mean, private philanthropists, you can do whatever you want. Like you don't have
Right,
to
there just has
be
to be a will and a desire to
right,
do these kinds of crazier things.
right, exactly. You don't have to be like, say, what do I want to give money to? I guess science. I guess I'll just give $100 million to Harvard. I mean, that's great, but you can also fund anything you want, and you can put up a prize for anything that you want, and people will probably come out of the woodwork, like the Scroll Prize. Like the thing I like about the kind of Scroll Prize type issues, just that the kinds of people who went to go work on that were not the kinds of people who would have necessarily thought of it in the first place and proposed it to a traditional funder. Instead, it's more like a funder says, "Hey, I've got a lot of money to dedicate to this fascinating issue," and then people that may not even look like academic scientists, or who aren't specialists in the thing that you're interested in, they come out of the woodwork and say, "Hey, if there's that much money at stake, I've got some ideas that I could bring from a different field." I think that's we should see a lot more of that. And if you're a philanthropist, and you can put up a $10 million, set of prizes for some interesting question, there are a lot of people that would probably, jump at the chance to work on that. It's just more imagination is needed on the part of philanthropists.
I love that. Maybe, I mean, given that we talked a lot about kind of like some of the downers with like federal funding and stuff like that, are there maybe like a good place to end might be on like a note of optimism? So, like, are there any like positive signs you're seeing on the horizon in terms of certain things around science funding or institutions? I mean, we've mentioned a couple things in terms of the philanthropy. Maybe you can kind of, yeah, just mention a few like signals that you've been detecting that kind of maybe give us a sense of hope.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned some earlier, but I mean, I do think, stuff like the Collisons and the Arc Institute, that's great. There are kind of other institutes like that, or even a little further from academia. So like Arcadia, which, they're pursuing a number of scientific projects kind of outside the traditional academic system. Focused research organizations, uh, There's, Schmidt, the stuff that Schmidt Futures and now Schmidt Sciences has funded. There's a philanthropist and trader in the UK named Alex Gurko, who has some creative ideas, like funding artificial intelligence and math, competitions, stuff like that. Yeah, again, I mentioned Nat Friedman, but yeah, I think having more public examples to point to and say, hey, you may not have anything that's exactly like the scrolls, but you can be like that guy. You can be like somebody who's like says, there's some fascinating problem in the world. I have some money to give to help solve it, and yeah, you ask for advice. I mean, I think what inhibits some philanthropists is maybe potential philanthropists is that they're so like head down 24/7 running their business or running their hedge fund or whatever it is they do, that they have more money to give away than they know what to do with, and it's not their full-time job. They already have a full-time job, and so then when it comes to their philanthropy, it's much easier to default to the traditional things as opposed to coming up with something that's truly creative, and knowing that you're actually going to make a difference and getting the right experts to advise you. I mean, that takes a lot more effort in a way. So I'm wondering if there are ways to also kind of make it easier for new wannabe philanthropists to step in. But I do think there are some good examples that I mentioned. So
I love that. And the fact that you shared a whole bunch of examples hopefully will give people a greater sense of, oh, right, there's like all these different weird things that you can be doing, right? It doesn't need to just be large checks to Harvard or wherever. No, I love that. That's probably a great place to end.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for chatting. This is fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.